Okay, we are on.
All right, terrific. Okay, so could somebody unmute and tell me whether you're seeing the slide okay?
It looks good on my end.
Okay, all right. So let me start here. If there's a bit of an overlap, that's okay. So here's the challenge you're going to have today. Think of the fiduciary movement as having three parts. One part was from 1987 to 2010. So I don't know what textbooks you're using for financial planning or papers that you might be looking at. But if you're looking at anything that predates, say, 2012, you're going to see that fiduciary is defined as a process. It's based on best practices. And the likelihood is, if you're looking at material that predates 2012, it's either material we produced, you'll see my name on a couple things, or referencing us in terms of fiduciary best practices. And what happened in 2010 was Dodd-Frank. And when Dodd-Frank was signed, there was a section to Dodd-Frank that instructed the SEC to define a uniform fiduciary standard. And unfortunately, when that happened, when you get Washington, D.C. involved in political gold, political capital, it gets messy. It's really bad. So the second phase, we're in the second phase right now. The second phase is the time when the regulators are attempting to define a fiduciary standard. Rather than following best practices, rather than defining fiduciary in terms of a process, which is what they should be doing, they're defining fiduciary in terms of very complex disclosures. So if you have ever had to read the DOL rule that came out in 2015, the 1,000-page DOL rule, hopefully you never had to do that. But if you did, you would have found it excruciating. Literally, I sat down one day and summarized the 1,000-page rule in 100 words. I mean, that's how bad it was. No, the 100 words was good. The DOL rule was bad. You pick up a paper today and you can read how New Jersey has come out with a uniform fiduciary standard. Again, they're using the word uniform fiduciary standard. When you read the rule, it's not a fiduciary standard. It's just rules to control the conduct of advisors and brokers and financial planners. And they slap the word fiduciary on the rules, but it's not a fiduciary standard. So there's going to be confusion. You know, you're looking at textbooks that talk about best practices and process. You pick up the paper today and you read what the states and the federal regulators are still attempting to do, and you go, man, what I'm reading in the paper, I'm sorry, not the paper, what I'm reading on the internet is not consistent with what I studied in the books. So because of that, 3 years ago, our company, 3 Ethos, saw a need to actually define a new standard of care for the industry that would get us back to the original point being the purpose of a fiduciary standard is to define a gold standard for professionals. In other words, a higher standard of care than what is required by regulators, and to define the specific practices that will improve the management of investment decisions or the management of a financial planning process. So that's where 3 Ethos, our company, is focused, is on defining a much, much higher standard of care than what the regulators are talking about. So what you're seeing on this slide is what our framework looks like in terms of an infographic. So I'll talk this through. your neurological capacity, your brain capacity, will determine the quality of your leadership and stewardship, which in turn is going to determine the quality of your governance or your fiduciary standard of care. And you're going to see more of this now through the night. So there's two parts to the framework. There's neuroscience, which is the science, and then behavioral governance, which is the process. Neuroscience is the science, and it includes your neurological capacity and how that neurological capacity impacts your leadership and stewardship. The science of neurofiduciary is based on what is now considered world-famous research in neuro leadership. And this research has identified key neurological capacities that impact the quality of your decision-making process. So as a review, what I talked about on Sunday night, there was a team of 5 academic researchers that about 6 or 7 years ago conducted the research. It was EEG research on the subject of neuroleadership. So, you've seen pictures of EEG research. They put a cap, looks like a swimmer's cap on a person's head. The old technology had wires coming off. The new technology today is all Bluetooth, so it just looks like a swimmer's cap with bottle caps on it. And they used the EEG research to look at neurological capacity to see if they could see a difference in brain capacity, brain activity, hot spots in the brain between an exemplary leader or a person who had the potential to become an exemplary leader versus the rest of us. In this research, the academics identified 6 neurological markers. So there's 6 parts of the brain of an exemplary leader that have more capacity than the rest of us. And we'll talk about those 6 hotspots here in a little bit. In turn, one of the academic professors doing the research was a gentleman named Sean Hanna. And Sean Hanna came to me in 2015 to see if he could join 3 Ethos. We had done the research on leadership, stewardship, and governance. He came and said, look, I think I've got the academic research to validate your framework. At that point in 2015, he was not an academic rock star. But shortly thereafter, this research became world famous. And in 2017, Sean was recognized by the Academy of Management as the most impactful professor in the world in the fields of leadership and management. So tonight, when you see what we have to present to you, this is the real McCoy. I mean, this is leading edge scientific and academic research that is now being redirected to the world of fiduciary responsibility. So if neurofiduciary is the science, behavioral governance is the process. And the 2 parts to behavioral governance, it's the same leadership and stewardship behaviors and how those behaviors determine the quality of your decision-making process. Here's the graphic associated with that, behavioral governance. And by the way, behavioral governance is a new body of science. We actually created the term. So behavioral governance is a new body of research that examines the interrelationships between leadership, stewardship, and governance. And what the neuroscientists have now determined is that the quality of your behavioral governance, the quality of that interrelationship between your leadership and stewardship behaviors and your decision-making is going to determine the level of your success. And here's the definitions that we're using for leadership, stewardship, and governance. So Sunday night, I mentioned the fact that In 2007, I took an 18-month sabbatical away from the work I was doing in fiduciary to go back to the United States Coast Guard Academy to head up their leadership think tank. And I had a lot of different projects put on my desk. And one of the first things I wanted to do was to come up with a concise definition of leadership. The Coast Guard had a definition, the Academy had a slightly different definition, industry had different definitions, but what they all had in common is that these definitions of stewardship were a couple sentences long, or maybe it looked like a paragraph, but it was actually one sentence. You know how those are, just rambles on and on and on. And I said, if I'm going to teach leadership, I want to teach a definition that people can actually remember. And I said, they're not going to remember these paragraph long definitions. So we spent a long time. I mean, we spent a couple months. Now, I'm not every day focusing on this definition, but we spent a long time honing the wording to get down to as precise a definition as we possibly could get. And this is what we have been using now for about 10 years. Leadership is your ability to inspire and engage others. And there's two tenets: inspire and engage. So I'm sure at this point in your careers, you've met people that are really inspiring, but they can't get a sandwich out of a lunch bag. Or vice versa. You might have a very capable person, a terrific project manager, but they don't inspire you. When you think about the men and women who have had the most impact on your life, teachers, clergy, band directors, coaches, I'm sure what they have all shared in common is that they emotionally inspired you and engaged you, encouraged you to become a better person. Stewardship is your passion and discipline to protect the long-term interests of others. This definition and the concept of adding stewardship to our framework was a result of Penn State and Joe Paterno. Now, you were probably in high school in 2011. November 2011 is when all hell broke loose at Penn State. And we were trying to apply a lot of the leadership principles that we were working into our framework. And what we discovered is that those principles did not adequately describe or define what was going on at Penn State. When I say what was going on, the damage that the trustees, the board of directors, were doing to the reputation, not only of Joe Paterno, but also of the university. And so we realized we needed to have a definition to capture what was going wrong. And we found that the best term to summarize what we were experiencing or what we were observing was this concept of stewardship. A good steward, the trustees, what the trustees should have been doing, they should have had a passion and discipline to protect the long-term interests of others. And then the third definition is governance, and that's your capacity to manage the details of a prudent decision-making process. And by the way, that is another big part of departure or a differentiation from the historical notion of fiduciary versus what the regulators are trying to do today. Historically, fiduciary has always been about, can you demonstrate the details of a prudent decision-making process? With the regulators, they have totally ignored the process. They're basing everything on fiduciary on rules and disclosures. All right, so a review of the framework again. Your neurological capacity is going to determine the quality of your leadership and stewardship, which will determine the quality of your decision-making. So let's start with the 6 neurological markers. So again, these are the hot spots. This is the capacity that exemplary leaders demonstrate that the rest of us may be struggling with. So the first neurological capacity that separates the exemplary leader from the rest of us is procedural justice, which is your capacity for moral and ethical leadership. It's your ability to enact a fair, just, and transparent process to resolve moral conflicts or to allocate limited resources. Now, what's really cool, this research that you're looking at was done for the purpose of defining the exemplary leader. If I had not said that this came from research to examine the exemplary leader, would you not say that this also defines an exemplary financial planner, an exemplary advisor, or a broker? Second, I call it the follow me capacity. So you're with a group of people and somebody comes in and says, look, we got a project we got to get done. Here's what we need to do. We need it done by tomorrow. And everybody in the room turns and stares at one person. Okay, Alice. Okay, John, you're in charge. Get it done. That's what we call the capacity for vision and inspiration. It's your ability to connect with others, to define a shared vision. Let's get everybody on the same page, to engage others, and to gain alignment and commitment from everybody else. Third capacity is for self-complexity. That's your capacity to understand your own self-worth within a changing world. It's your ability to adjust and adapt to changes in your environment. One way to test your capacity for self-complexity: how long does it take for you to get over a broken heart? What the scientists will tell you is the greater capacity you have for self-complexity, the easier and faster it is for you to get over a broken heart. Fourth, I hope you don't abuse your dogs this way. I'm trying to remember what the command is for this. I forget, but you're all familiar with what I'm talking about here. All right, this is executive control. You don't give in to temptation as executive control. Number 5, this is my favorite. This is situational awareness. I call this the Sully capacity. So this would be Captain Sully. This would be the miracle of the Hudson. This took place in 2009. As a refresher, there was 210 seconds from the time the bird strike occurred till the plane had landed in the water. So think about that. He takes off. They're climbing up to 3,000 feet. Bird strike. First thing he has to understand is, what do I have? Do I still have 1 engine, 2 engines? What do I have? At the same time, he's analyzing what is happening with the bird strike. He is now turned to return back to LaGuardia. So as a military pilot, what I can tell you is you got a thump in the middle of the night. You see the dials and the gauges, unwinding in the cockpit. Very first thing you do is you turn towards the closest landing area. So he begins the turn, and with the co-pilot, they start going through the emergency procedures. And very quickly, Sully realizes that the emergency procedures are going to take longer to conduct than he's going to remain in the air. So he makes the decision to jump ahead of certain emergency procedures and begin an emergency descent. So he's now realizing He's lost both engines. They're attempting to do a restart. It's pretty clear the engines are not going to come back on. So now he has to make a determination, have I in fact turned to the proper airport? I turned back to where I took off, but there's another airport across the Hudson, the Teterboro. Would it make more sense if I turn towards Teterboro? So now at this point, Sully has to communicate all of this to traffic control to have them help him determine which airport he should turn to. As they're making up their mind, Sully realizes he's not going to make either airport. And the only appropriate response is to put the plane down on the Hudson. So now he's got to prepare the plane to make an emergency landing on the Hudson, which he does. Now, if you had a stopwatch to my explanation of what happened was longer than the actual event. That is situational awareness. Situational awareness. You have a person that has the capacity to say, what's going on in the current situation? How is it going to impact my goals and objectives and project into the future? How is this current situation going to be played out into the future? And in the sixth capacity is social astuteness. You could also call this EQ if you've ever studied EQ. So this is your capacity for social intelligence, interpersonal influence, networking, and sincerity. So those 6 markers are going to determine the quality of your leadership and stewardship. In the English language, we have more than 250 words that we can use to describe leadership and stewardship. About 250 different words. So why these 10 specific words? For 2 reasons. They're tied to the neurological markers, and they also are shown to amplify and improve a decision-making process. So once again, why these 10 behaviors? They're tied to neurological capacity, or they're based on neurological capacity, and they improve decision-making. Now, what else do you see when you look at these 10 behaviors? That's right. The leadership behaviors all start with C. And the stewardship behaviors all start with A. What's the difference between the leadership and the stewardship behaviors? That's right. Moral capacity. For example, it takes more moral energy. It takes more moral capacity to be courageous than it is to be accountable. It takes more moral capacity to be compassionate than it does to become authentic. So this is a little freaky. When I talked about the 250 words, the other exercise we went through is you identify the words to describe a good decision maker, a good project manager. And again, you end up with about 250 different words. So imagine you're in a room and on one wall has yellow stickies with the 250 leadership and stewardship words, and in the opposite wall has yellow stickies with behaviors that talk about great decision makers, great project managers. Now you stand in the room, middle of the room, and you say, what words appear on both walls? In other words, what words have been written on a sticky on the leadership role, and the same word is being used to describe a great decision maker. These are the 10 words. Now, here's the decision-making process. This is a dramatic shift in the historical work we did with defining fiduciary best practices. So 30 years ago, when we began to define what does it mean to be a fiduciary, we had identified 27 different practices that were substantiated by regulations, case law, and regulatory opinion letters. And in turn, we were, in defining those best practices, 27 best practices, we were using the legalese and we were using the language from the asset management industry. But we still communicated as best we could in plain English what the practices should be, with the intent that we would train trustees on the practices. So let me digress here for a second. How many men and women do you think serve in a fiduciary capacity in our country today?
Maybe, 100,000. I mean, I'm just thinking all the bank people that I know that are fiduciaries or serve in a fiduciary capacity.
Uh-huh. Anybody else want to embarrass themselves with a guess? Go for it, Austin.
I was going to say more around like the 6,000 mark.
8 million. Yeah, 8 million men and women. So where do we get that number? It's the men and women who are sitting on investment committees for foundations, endowments, personal trusts. We would have seen that at the bank. Retirement plans. I can tell you from 30 years of experience that if there are 8 million investment fiduciaries, 7,950,000 don't know what they're doing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In turn, the 8 million are managing 80%, 80, of our nation's liquid investable wealth. So you back out the value of the family home and the small family-owned business, and you're left with this notion of the nation's liquid investable wealth. 80% of that liquid investable wealth is managed by the 8 million. Now, who's responsible for training the 8 million? Think about it. The 8 million are managing 80% of our nation's liquid investable wealth. Their conduct has a direct impact on the fiscal health of this nation. So who's responsible for training the 8 million?
This is Audrey. I guess I will say the CFP Board of Standards perhaps plays a major role in that, in addition to perhaps the SEC.
So Audrey, since you're still on active duty, drop and give me 25. No, not the CFP board. You missed Sunday night. CFP board has done more harm to this work than any organization.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. SEC doesn't have a clue what a fiduciary should be doing, even though they're the regulator for a good portion of the 8 million. No, they don't take responsibility for that.
I think it's on each and every person who's a fiduciary to educate themselves. I mean, there are some organizations that will provide you information, and there's certainly case law, but There's, in my experience as a fiduciary, both sitting on boards and working in a bank trust company, nobody's going to train you unless you actively look for training.
Beautiful. You're absolutely correct. And that is the problem. You know, what percentage of the people that have agreed to serve as a fiduciary, you know, you can't put a gun to somebody's head and say, you're going to be a fiduciary. A lot of times it's by role. Think about the 401k plan at a company. So, all right, we need to have a board of trustees, an investment committee. Why don't we put the CFO on the committee, the head of HR, 2 department heads? All right, you're now the fiduciaries, and you're responsible for the 401k plan. How many of those 8 million voluntarily go out and seek help on being a fiduciary? It's incredibly small. And this is what we finally have come to grips with in the last couple of years. Can we blame the trustees for not being proactive in seeking training? And my response to that now is quite different than what it would have been 10 years ago. They're not at fault. You know, these trustees that end up on the committees are leaders within their community, are leaders within their business, or should be. And they're busy. They have a lot of demands put on them. That's number one. Now, that's not a good excuse, but I'm telling you, that's one of the reasons why 95% don't know what they're doing. The second reason is we've made it too complicated. We've been trying to teach these trustees a fiduciary process they may use maybe once a quarter. These investment committees at best are meeting once a quarter. Oftentimes it's every 6 months, maybe even once a year. And you can imagine if someone is trying to teach you this arcane language associated with fiduciary law and portfolio management, and you're only exercising that language once a quarter, every 6 months, you're never going to master it. You're never going to get it. So the objective now is, let's teach these clients, these trustees, a decision-making process they can use every day. So now when you look at the slide, what you'll see is plain English, and the language is universal. So if somebody said, I'm a new trustee on a 401k investment committee, I can hand them this 5-step process, and there's 2 dimensions to each step, so there's 10 dimensions. I can hand them this process and say, follow this process in managing the 401k plan. At the same time, I could ask a trustee, well, what is it you do for the company? Well, I'm a department head. Maybe I'm in charge of shipping and receiving. Terrific. So you're responsible for other people and running a department. Yeah. Here's a framework you can use to manage your department. So the beautiful thing now, we can work with, the way we say it, we work with, or we accelerate the development of any key decision maker who is serving in a critical leadership and stewardship role. So now our work is relevant to any industry, any sector, and any domain. We're not limited to just the financial services industry. Okay, I'm going to pause there. Any questions, comments? This is really important.
I had a question. This is Mona.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like what you're saying is that your proposal is that your company will be doing the training for the 8 million fiduciaries around the world, around the country, and that's who will be training fiduciaries because it does not currently exist. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, I wish we had the opportunity to train all 8 million. But yeah, that's very, very close. Our mission, there's only 5 of us. The company is 5 people, 2 of whom are professors. So you can imagine none of those 2 aren't doing anything. I have a retired admiral, 2-star admiral. You think he's doing any work? He's not doing any work. But no, our philosophy is train the trainer. So Doug went through our program last summer. So we are training other professionals to deliver this framework to the marketplace.
I had one other question.
Mm-hmm.
And thank you. That would answer my question, that one. But I had one more. I'm just curious, and maybe it's in your next slides, but how do you hold people accountable to this standard?
That's a very good question. Doug, give Mona extra credit. How do we hold people accountable? A couple ways to answer that question. One way is through the courts, and that's obviously the absolute worst way. However, when trustees have been dragged into court and have suffered economic consequences for not meeting fiduciary standards, those court decisions become widely known. And you will see trustees kind of wake up. For example, for probably the last 10 years, I think it is 10 years, most of the lawsuits in the 401k space have been on fees and expenses. The lawsuit being that the trustees were not controlling and accounting for the fees associated with the management of the 401k plan. And for the most part, most of the, more than 50% of the cases, the trustees have lost. In other words, they have failed to demonstrate in a court of law that they acted prudently. Well, those lawsuits have been a wake-up call to the trustees of the 401k investment committees. And so we're seeing an improvement, some improvement. I don't want to get too long-winded on this, some improvement. But like most regulations, there's unintended consequences. And in this case, what you're seeing is a lot of the 401k plans now shopping for the lowest provider, the cheapest provider. And that the lowest provider is not always the best service provider for a particular 401k plan. So just because they went cheaper doesn't necessarily mean that they improved the governance of their 401k plan. So how do we make people accountable? I would say what holds people accountable is the court of public opinion. If fiduciaries have any sensitivity, it's that they don't want people accusing the trustees of inappropriately managing the money. The other sensitivity that we're working on is that more and more employers are becoming sensitive to their leadership and stewardship role. I don't have a slide in this deck. For the last 10 or 12 years, sociologists have been doing surveys with employees on engagement and trust. And the results, there's 3 sociologists that we've been following in particular, LRN, Gallup, and Edelman. And those 3 groups have done their surveys every year, and the results are almost always the same. In fact, I'll ask the question. What percentage of men and women wake up in the morning, put their feet on the floor, and are not inspired or engaged in working for their company? What percentage?
I say 70%.
Who said that?
Audrey.
Okay, you can stop doing the push-ups.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Doug, Audrey gets extra credit. That's precisely the number. 70% of American workers are not inspired by the company they work for. That's beginning to have an impact on CEOs. They're beginning to pay attention to the fact they need to be doing more to be viewed as a leader and steward of their employees. Now, what's very interesting about that statistic is this year in 2019, the numbers have begun to reverse. Not dramatically, but for the first time in 10 to 12 years, there's an improvement that our employees are beginning to put more trust in the company they work for. Why do you think that is? What has changed so that employees are beginning to put a little bit more trust in the company they work for? Human nature wants to trust somebody, something. Last 10 or 12 years, we didn't trust the man. We didn't trust the employer. So we were redirecting trust to national organizations such as the church and the government. And as those national institutions have become a disappointment, remember human nature, we want to trust in something. As those national institutions become a disappointment, they're coming back to put the trust in their local environment, in this case, in their place of work. Okay, I better pick up the pace. All right, what's this? Holy cow, look at that. Austin, what do you think? You impressed, Austin?
I like it.
Okay, this is a psychometric instrument. So when I say psychometric instrument, think about Myers-Briggs, think about DISC, Jolly, think about what Austin and his family have been doing for 30 years. So what you'll see on the right-hand side here is we have developed an instrument with the neuroscientists where we can assess the 5 behaviors associated with leadership, the 5 behaviors associated with stewardship, and the 5-step process we were just looking at. By the way, in this instrument, a max score is 35. So don't think, oh my God, this is a 100-point scale, and we got people out there with a leadership behavior of 17. With the instrument, we can take a deeper dive. So in this case, if we're looking at somebody's leadership, we can quickly see that their strength is being a person of good character. And in turn, their shortfall, their weakness, their blind spot is being a compassionate. So if I wanted to understand more about what it takes to be compassionate, what I need to be doing to improve, to be a person that is more compassionate, I would click on the radio button, and it would take me to the items in the instrument that were assessed to come up with the compassionate score. And it's pretty straightforward. It's bar charts. The shorter the bar, the more the problem. The longer the bar, it's a strength. Blue is the self-assessment. Red is the score of other professionals that also took the instrument. And the gray bar is plus or minus 1 standard deviation. So you can see the range of scores from other professionals. So if I was coaching Doug and this was his score, I'd say, okay, Doug, 2 things in particular we need to be working on. One is showing empathy, and the second is advocating for the well-being of others. So if we talked through that, and Doug said, well, I'm still not sure I'm compassionate, we can click on the 14.4, the radio button, and now it's going to take us to a new website that's being built And the website is based on augmented learning. So as adults, we all have different preferences on how we learn. So Doug could click on the button, be taken to the website that has been set up to provide additional instruction on being compassionate. And being an adult then, Doug can choose how he wants to be developed. What's his preferred method of learning? In my case, I prefer to see videos. I'd rather watch a TED Talk than read a blog. So I could click on videos and it would give a listing of the videos, a lot of them being TED Talks, that talk about the importance of being compassionate and how compassion plays into being a great steward and a leader. In turn, with the instrument, we're now collecting big data on key decision makers. We're collecting big data on fiduciaries. So these are the actual results from 2018 of more than 250 professionals. These were primarily retirement plan professionals. So we know from the big data that their strength is in being a person of good character, authentic, accountable, compassionate, and competent. In turn, where they have shortfalls and blind spots is in being adaptive, attentive, courageous, aligned, and collaborative. Lowest score from these 250 professionals is being collaborative. Now, let me talk about that for a second, because this is a pretty neat fact here. Collaborative. If you end up working for somebody that's over the age of 45 and you get them to take this instrument, you can bet their lowest score is going to be in collaboration. And there's a reason why. Anybody over the age of 45 when they were in college, graduating from college, working on their MBA, they were taught that their role models should be the likes of Jack Welch and Lee Iacocca. I mean, these might even be names you don't even recognize today. In turn, somebody over the age of 45 went into a work environment that was still based on principles that were developed during World War II, specifically the concept of charisma and top-down command and control. Around the world, people that were doing leadership research discovered in surveys, what kind of characteristics and traits, what kind of behavior do you want to see in your leaders? Around the world, didn't matter what country. Charisma dropped off. Collaboration went to the top. So when you get back out into the workforce, you're going to feel like you want to be in an environment where you have a sense of purpose. The company has a sense of purpose. You want to be able to participate in the culture, in developing the ethos of the company. You want an environment where there's collaboration. And you may start knocking heads with senior management that doesn't feel the same way. This is why. They were never trained on collaboration. Collaboration just doesn't, when they think about leadership and stewardship, they're thinking patent. That's the challenge. Now, how do these low scores impact a fiduciary process, a fiduciary standard of care? So the same thing, we can rank order that 5-step process, and we can see in the case of retirement advisors, they have fairly good scores in implementation, picking money managers, picking funds. They're pretty good at that. They're pretty good at monitoring. Okay, I put you in this fund. It's not doing so well. We might have to change that out. Okay, in helping you define goals and objectives. But their weak spot, their blind spot, is in developing the strategy. What's the best investment strategy? What's the best financial plan for you? And communicating that strategy to the client. So now look at the two sides. If you're a blind spot, if you're weak in collaboration, if you're weak in alignment, in other words, you're not helping the client align their goals and objectives with the financial strategy, if you're weak in being adaptive and you're weak in being attentive, how is that going to play out in your decision-making process? You're going to do a lousy job of developing the strategy. Okay. Now I'm going to, hey, Doug, I'm not going to be able to get through all the slides. Okay, if we cut this off here in a little bit. You're on mute, Doug. I'm going to collaborate
Yeah,
here.
there you go.
Yeah.
You don't have to, you're only limited to your own, how far you want to go, Don.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to show you just a couple more slides. I'm going to be mindful of the fact we're coming up on the top of the hour. So one of the other things you're coming into, besides the fact you're going to be dealing in an environment where the regulators don't know what they're talking about, the other thing that's happening right now is fee compression. The money managers are lowering their fees. In some cases, some firms have lowered their fees by 90%. Assets now are going into no-load funds and ETFs. Fee compression, fees are coming down. When fees come down, now the role of the financial planner becomes one of the most expensive line items. What am I paying you, Nicole? So how do you overcome that? How do you deal with fee compression? You have to demonstrate that to your client that you're more than a financial planner. What you have to become to your client is their most important leader and steward. Through the eyes of your client, they've got to view you as a leader and a steward. And if they don't view you as a leader and a steward, they're going to complain about your fees, and they're going to be easily swept up by the next advisor or financial planner that does come across as a legitimate leader and steward. How about this? Actually, I developed this to really screw with you. I knew it would come up late in the night. Here's what's going on with this. This is artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence. The takeaway with artificial intelligence is we can now do more predictive analytics. So when you look at due diligence associated with selecting investment options, almost 100% of that due diligence is based on historical data, historical performance. You're going to see within the next year, 2 years, AI, artificial intelligence coming in, where now we begin to incorporate artificial intelligence in a predictive manner, looking into the future, what will be the best performing funds and investment options. And then the last thing I want to talk about, and then we'll close up, the difference between robo-fiduciary and robo-advisor. You're all familiar with robo-advisor? All right, so what's the difference? It's this. Horizontal axis is governance, decision-making. Vertical axis is leadership and stewardship. A robo-advisor can only digitize decision-making. It obviously can't be a leader and a steward. It can't tie to the emotions of the client as a leader and steward. Only a person can do that. Only you can do that. So when you graph that out, what is the difference between robo-fiduciary and robo-advisor? It is your neurofiduciary and behavioral governance. All right.
Don, I'd like you to just give your Old Testament, New Testament metaphor.
I don't have the graphic for that.
You don't need a graphic.
Oh.
Difference between the old way and the new way.
Yeah.
Stewardship and Moses coming down from the mountain.
Yeah.
Ten
All right.
Commandments.
Yeah. Okay. Gotta think that through here for a second. Yeah, this is why, thank you, Doug. This is why what the regulators are attempting to do will not work. The regulators are attempting to define rules. So what Doug is talking about, Old Testament, is rules-based. Old Testament is the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not. Human nature being what it is, when we're given a rule, we try to work around it. Thou shalt not kill. And what's going through our mind? Oh, wait a minute, what a time of war. What about in self-defense? What about to save the child, save the mother? What about in terms of capital punishment? So human nature, we try to do a workaround rules. With what we're doing, we're defining principles. That's New Testament. Principles. Love one another. So when I say love one another, in fact, that's very fitting for Maundy Thursday. Tonight is Last Supper. That was the command of Jesus to his disciples. Love one another. When I give you a principle, love one another, now where does your mind go? It struggles. It struggles with that workaround. So to instill higher behavior, it is more effective to define that behavior in terms of principles than in terms of rules.
One of the students wanted you to elaborate a little bit on where you got cut off with the CFP boards and your stance on this.
Yeah, okay. So I should do some clarification. I think I might have even accused the CFP board of pulling the Zoom plug on us on Sunday night. What's happening with CFP board, it's a couple of the staff people on the board of directors, staff people that have been there for a long time. They view fiduciary as being an opportunity to increase their power over the industry. So if you consider that's their objective, they want to increase their power, how would they view somebody like myself and 3 Ethos? You know, we're a threat. And so since the CFP board has control over continuing education, in 2010, they said I was no longer qualified to provide CE. I was no longer qualified to teach fiduciary courses to CFPs. So they, you know, it's a conflict, you know, being an organization that it is, a not-for-profit organization. The staff cannot be using its power, the power to distribute CE for their own personal gain. The more power they have, the more money they make. In fact, the CEO of the CFP board now is making more than $1 million a year. When you add his compensation, it's more like, you know, $1,250,000 a year. How does he justify receiving a salary like that? What he'll tell you is, well, you know, I've introduced the fiduciary standard to CFPs. Well, he didn't. But just the same, you know, he's putting pressure on us. In fact, 2015, he and another company that I'm not going to mention dragged me into federal court and tried to get a federal judge to muzzle me, muzzle my criticism of the CFP board. Fortunately, the federal judge threw it out. So I'm still allowed to criticize the CFP board. So an important differentiation here. I firmly believe in the marks. I do believe the CFP curriculum is the absolute best way to prepare for a comprehensive financial planning career. I am not familiar with AFC. Doug, I want to follow up with you on that. But I absolutely believe in the training, the quality of the training. It's just the governance of the board itself, the people that are running the marks, that I don't trust. And I'm going to continue to put pressure on them, particularly in the press, because as you know, in October, the CFP board now is going to impose a higher fiduciary standard of care on CFP certificates. And my argument is going to be, it is wrong for the CFP board to try to administer a fiduciary standard of care when you have moral and ethical conflicts, undisclosed conflicts, and self-dealing going on at the board itself. That's my CFP story.
Any other quick questions out there before we let Don go?
Yeah, would we be able to get the rest of the entire slide deck?
Yes, go ahead and get that from Doug. Okay. Absolutely.
Tamrat, you can download those for me. I appreciate it.
Well, that's right. Yeah, I have not. Yeah, I will do that tonight. Yeah. Yeah.
Any thoughts on the BIC rule, best interest of client rule?
Yeah, it's here's my comment. It's not worth much. What the SEC is proposing, it's, I don't know, 5% of what we just covered tonight. I mean, what we're doing with behavioral governance and neurofiduciary is light years ahead of where the regulators are. It's just that's my comment. I mean, it's just so bad. I don't want to say don't even bother or waste your time learning about it, but it's just so bad. So bad, in fact, what I have said to the press, what the regulators are doing is causing more harm than good.
Mm.
All right, if there's not any further comment, this will be recorded and you can look back on it. I really, really appreciate your patience as we got through this. You went above and beyond the call.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
I'll have to see if there's a University of Nebraska coin.
Yeah.
So next time I'm going to make sure you bring that mug, though.
I went looking. We moved in January, and I had it before the move, and I cannot find it. I mean, I was using it about every fourth day.
Well, I'll have to get you a big red end.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, all. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Right. Bye-bye.
Bye.